This is Flavor Profile, a series where we look at ingredients that are similar to each other, in some cases even interchangeable. We discuss what makes them similar, but more importantly, where they're distinct. This is a massive flavor profile on mushrooms. Mushrooms are fungi, which taxonomically speaking is a kingdom all to itself, distinct from plants and animals. Although technically speaking, they're slightly closer related to animals than they are to plants. But that being said, you will find them most often in the produce department of your grocery store or foraged in the wild. There are over 2,000 varietals of edible mushrooms we've found so far, but very few are cultivated for human consumption. I've already done an entire flavor profile on conventional mushrooms, which you can watch here. This flavor profile is going to be centered on what I would call specialty mushrooms, mushrooms that are cultivated but are more rarely found than the big three of button, cremini, and portobello. During today's flavor profile, we'll be covering 7 different types of mushroom: lion's mane, shiitake, enoki, oyster, king trumpet, maitake, and shimeji. Let's break it down. Lion's mane mushrooms are white, shaggy mushrooms that may not resemble what you conventionally think of as a mushroom. They have a dense white body and little fluffy hairs on the edge. They almost resemble a lion's mane as they grow out. Unlike some of the other mushrooms we're going to cover, lion's mane mushrooms don't really taste that mushroomy. They have a mild, sweet flavor that some people compare to poultry while others compare to lobster. Lion's mane can either be foraged in the wild or found cultivated. Lion's mane mushrooms are an incredibly important part of traditional Chinese medicine. Although additional studies need to be done, there has been some evidence shown that lion's mane mushrooms might contribute to reduced anxiety, depression, and a lower rate of heart disease. Due to their potential health benefits, lion's mane mushrooms can be found both fresh and in dried form. When preparing lion's mane mushrooms to cook, you should cut off the bottom part where they would attach to the substrate and then break the large body into smaller pieces. You can also cut lion's mane mushrooms into steaks and grill them as a meat substitute. Shiitake mushrooms are small, delicate brown mushrooms. They have a wrinkly stem and relatively small cap with visible gills. Shiitake mushrooms are incredibly popular worldwide. In fact, they make up about 25% of worldwide consumption, which, second to the conventional mushroom, is a really large amount. Shiitake have been cultivated by humans for centuries. In fact, our oldest records show them being cultivated as early as the 13th century. Shiitake have a delicate texture and a rich umami flavor, and they can be found both raw and in dried form. Dried shiitake are actually incredibly popular for sauces and soups, and when rehydrated, they actually have a pretty good texture. So if you can find them dried but not fresh, you should still go ahead and get them. Shiitake mushrooms should never be eaten raw. Although it's rare, some people do have an allergic reaction to it, but when you cook them, the risk of that allergic reaction essentially goes away. Shiitake are more often than not served either sautéed or stir-fried. Enoki mushroom are a very interesting mushroom. They are incredibly long and thin with small caps, and they clump together at the bottom. Enoki mushrooms generally come in a pale white and are very common in East Asian cuisines. I can almost always find them at my local H Mart. Enoki have a delicate texture and delicate flavor, but are bitter when eaten raw and generally not advised to be eaten that way. But when you cook them, that bitter flavor becomes more nutty and sweet. When preparing enoki to cook, you should cut off about the bottom inch of them and then break them into smaller portions before cooking. Enoki are incredibly popular stir-fried or served in soups. Either way, you should cook them till they still have a little bit of crunch for optimum texture. Oyster mushrooms are a type of mushroom that are cultivated but also can be foraged worldwide. They come in many varietals. Here I have the pearl and the golden oyster, but you can also find pink and even blue oysters. While each varietal of oyster mushroom will taste different, they all taste vaguely like seafood, ergo their name, oyster mushroom. Oyster mushrooms are considered a specialty and therefore are coveted by many cuisines worldwide. You'll find them at many specialty grocery stores or cultivated on logs or in grow bags. Oyster mushrooms in the wild are often found on dead or dying trees, and because their preferred substrate is wood, they're easier to clean than some mushrooms that grow in the dirt. You usually can just wipe them off, although you can rinse them in water if necessary. Like most clumping mushrooms, before cooking them, you should cut off the rough bottom part where they all connect, since it's pretty dense and the texture doesn't get much better when you cook it. King trumpet mushrooms are just another varietal of oyster mushroom, although they're different enough that I'm going to cover them separately. King trumpets also go by the name king oyster, French horn, or trumpet royale. They have an off-white stem that is relatively large compared to the small brown cap, and you can see some faint gills on the bottom. King trumpet mushrooms are especially common in South Korea, where they make up about 30% of consumed mushrooms. King trumpet mushrooms have a very rich flavor and dense meaty texture, and therefore are often used as meat substitutes in vegan or vegetarian cooking. You can just dice these up small before cooking them, but you're losing a little bit of the drama and texture. Generally, it's recommended to either slice them into rings if you want to use them as scallop substitutes. When I grill them sliced in half, I generally cut a crosshatch pattern onto them before cooking them. That helps you achieve maximum caramelization and helps them absorb more sauces. Maitake mushrooms, or hen of the woods, not to be confused with chicken of the woods, which is a different foraged mushroom, are delicate, feathery mushrooms that clump together at the bottom. Maitake mushrooms grow natively in both China and the eastern US, although they've been found as far west as Idaho. Maitake have a delicate, earthy flavor. While you'll probably find small clumps of maitake at the grocery store, they can be found in giant clumps in the wild. In fact, the largest one of record was over 100 pounds. You can wash maitake before cooking them, but because of all the folds, they can be very difficult to then properly dry before cooking. I would generally recommend breaking them into smaller pieces and dusting them off with a paper towel instead of fully submerging them in water. If you do choose to wash them in water, just make sure you dry them off as best you can before cooking them. When properly cooked, maitake should still have a delicate crunch to them. Shimeji, or beach mushrooms, are actually several species that all go under the same name. The two most common varietals, which I have here, are white and brown. Like many of these mushrooms here, for safety reasons, they're not recommended to be eaten raw, but you also wouldn't really want to. They have a very bitter flavor. But when cooked, they develop a much more pleasant flavor. The white ones have a mild, earthy flavor, while the brown ones develop almost a nutty flavor. While more research needs to be done, shimeji mushrooms contain some compounds that might be natural anti-cancer agents. Like most clumping mushrooms, before cooking shimeji mushrooms, you should remove the bottom where they all attach together. The texture is not going to be super great. And then you can break them down into smaller portions and cook them. They're popular pickled or stir-fried. I'm going to pop in here for a minute to just say how wild this kitchen smells right now. It smells so much like mushrooms, but also kind of like seafood, but also kind of like dirt, and I'm not minding it. But in case you were wondering, yes, having this many mushrooms this close to you smells like a lot. Okay, bye. And now I think Alex has some questions for us, so 1 second.
Hey, I'm Alex, and I have some questions. Tara, I was noticing that there are some mushrooms that you can't find in the store unless it's a very specific time of year. Why is it easy to cultivate some mushrooms, but others need to be foraged?
The mushrooms that we see are actually the fruiting bodies of a very large mycelium network underneath the ground. That means as far as these organisms go, they have very complex needs in order to grow and fruit. Mushrooms need certain climates to be happy. They need fluctuations in temperature, water, humidity, soil nutrients. All that to say, it's not very easy to replicate the environment that a mushroom needs to grow. Some mushrooms are very easy to cultivate and grow. The cultivated mushrooms, button, Creminium portabella, are some of the easiest, which is why they're so popular. Pretty much all the mushrooms we've talked about today, we've figured out how to cultivate, but others still elude us. For example, lobster mushrooms are formed when a fungus takes over another mushroom body. It's pretty much impossible to replicate that in our own growing environments. So there will forever be some mushrooms that we can cultivate and others we just have to forage in the wild.
So I've gone to the store, and I bought all these mushrooms, or maybe I went to the woods and I foraged a bunch of mushrooms, but now I have all these mushrooms. So what's the best way to store mushrooms?
When you buy mushrooms, they often come shrink wrapped in these little plastic tubs, but that's not actually the best way to store them. If you leave them in here, they're likely to go bad faster. The reason why is that mushrooms need the cold and wet to grow. But if you keep them exposed to cold and wet, they will deteriorate and stop being the pleasant texture we enjoy. You honestly would rather have a mushroom slightly dry out than get too damp. Because of that, when you get mushrooms at the store, you should take them out of these tubs and transfer them to a dry paper bag. I'll often even add a paper towel on the bottom to absorb the extra moisture. When stored the proper way, they can last about a week in the fridge.
Kara, these mushrooms seem very dirty. How do I get them not dirty? How do you clean mushrooms?
For some reason, people are terrified of washing mushrooms, and I understand that, because a wet mushroom will go bad faster. But that being said, you should wash and clean your mushrooms before cooking them. There are several simple experiments you can do on this, but basically it's been shown that mushrooms absorb very little water when they're washed. That being said, you don't want to start cooking a wet mushroom. One of the goals of cooking mushrooms is to evaporate the water out of them. So if you're starting with a wet mushroom, you're starting at a more difficult spot. So for something like a king trumpet that has very few folds, before cooking it, go ahead, wash it, pat it dry, slice it up, and cook it. You shouldn't be afraid of exposing your mushrooms to water. You can expose them to water, but just do it right before you cook them. Don't wash them the second you get home. That's gonna make them go bad way faster. Transfer them from your plastic container to a paper bag and let them stay in your fridge. But when it is time to cook them, you should absolutely wash your mushrooms.
Mushrooms are delicious, but if I've never cooked them before, how would you suggest I do that in a way that makes them taste good instead of tasting bad? Is there a specific cooking method that works for most mushrooms?
While there are many different ways to prepare and cook mushrooms, there's one method that I've found that works pretty well for most of these. You're gonna start by cleaning your mushrooms and breaking them down into the proper size for cooking. Then get a dry pan and place your mushrooms in it. You might think you wanna start by cooking them with oil, but you should avoid that at first. Mushrooms are full of water, and one of our goals when cooking them is to evaporate the water. If you add the oil right away, they'll often absorb that oil without actually getting rid of the water, and you get a soggy, oily mess. Instead, you should put your mushrooms in a dry pan and wait till that first flush of water has evaporated from them. At that point, you can add in your oils, your flavors, whatever you enjoy. Sometimes I'll add garlic and butter and then serve the mushrooms with a risotto. Other times you can add a little bit of sesame oil, maybe some fish sauce, and serve it with a rice bowl. But regardless, the base method stays the same. This has been a massive flavor profile on mushrooms. I know while doing research for this video, I learned a lot about mushrooms, and I hope that you've learned something too. And until next time, I'm Kara, and I can cook.